Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium. My name is Francesco Petruccione. I'm currently the interim director of NITheCS. Yeah. And this day we are very happy to have with us Professor Mark Solms, who will speak about a topic that is maybe a little bit off the mainstream of our colloquium, but nevertheless might have some very important implications for what some of us are doing. Yeah. Professor Solms is the director of the neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town, and he's also an honorary lecturer in neurosurgery at the St. Bartholomew's and Royal London School of Medicine. He's an A1 rated scientist according to the NRF grading, rating. He's a member of the South African, American, and British psychoanalytical societies and an honorary fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists. And over the years received numerous awards, honors, and recognitions. He's a very prolific author, and he published also a large number of very interesting books, the last one of which is The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. And probably what you're talking today might have some relationship with your last book. Yeah. So, Professor Solms, people are here to listen to you, not to listen to me. So you're most and welcome to share your screen if you have some slides that you would like to share with us. And while you do so, I will remind the participants to please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask questions. And maybe at the end of the talk, we can allow people to give people the right to speak, and they can ask the question in person. So please, you're most and welcome to start.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. It's very interesting for me to speak outside of my field, as it were. Excuse the light. This time of day, it shines in on my face, but hopefully you'll be attending to my screen rather than to my mug. So this is what I'm going to be talking to you about, the hard problem of consciousness. Here is the original formulation of that problem by David Chalmers, in which he says that our normal approach in cognitive neuroscience, where in order to understand the function, we dissect its mechanism. He says that this normal approach doesn't work when it comes to consciousness, because explaining the mechanism doesn't explain why there is something it is like to be performing that function. He says, why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? So that's the problem that I'm wanting to talk to you about today. I'm putting it in big letters on the screen so that we can all be clear. This is the hard problem. Let's see if we can make some headway with it. Now, Chalmers's work was based on that of another philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who wrote some 20 years earlier that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it's like for the organism. And then he goes on to say that currently we have no physical theory that gives us any clue as to how this comes about. So I want to put this version of the problem on the screen also, because my aim is to give us a clue about how we might tackle this problem. The way Nagel formulates it is like this: why and how is there something it's like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? So this is the hard problem of consciousness. Remember, Chalmers said that dissecting the function, our normal way of, our normal mechanistic approach in cognitive neuroscience doesn't work when it comes to this particular function, the function that we call consciousness. I must say I have some sympathy for Chalmers's view. Here is a so-called simplified diagram of the processing of information that goes on in the visual cortex, in this case of the macaque monkey, but it's the same, pretty much the same in human visual cortex. And what Chalmers is saying is that this kind of mechanistic account of information processing that goes on in the visual cortex doesn't give us any understanding as to why there is visual experience. Why is there something it is like to see? He draws on the argument of yet another philosopher, Frank Jackson, who, if I can just put it in very brief terms, says, imagine a visual neuroscientist named Mary who knows all about the stuff that's on the screen here. She knows all about the functional mechanisms of vision, but she's blind, so she's never had visual experience. If she were one day suddenly to be gifted with visual consciousness, in other words, if her blindness were to be cured, she would learn something utterly new about vision. In other words, what it is like to see, the quality of red and blue, of light and dark, and so on. These things, according to this argument, are not accounted for, they're not explained by, they're not even predicted by a functional mechanistic account of how visual information processing works. You might ask naively, as I did when I first learned this stuff as a student, I asked my professors when they showed me flow diagrams like this, I said, but where does it all come together? Where is the experiencing subject who actually is processing all this information and turns it into actual seeing? And they wisely informed me not to ask questions like that. It was bad for my career. Now, another way of looking at this problem, the problem that Chalmers and others are drawing our attention to, is that this sort of information processing that you see going on here can also be performed by something as simple as your cell phone, something like face recognition functionality, which the camera in your phone has, is exactly the sort of thing that this diagram explains, how it all works mechanistically. But of course, your cell phone doesn't have any visual experience. So Chalmers's question comes back again, so why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark? What does the experience add? What is it doing, and how does it relate to all this other mechanistic causation? I said I have some sympathy with this view. But partly that's because since the 1980s and 1990s, we have learned in my field, in neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience, that visual information processing in the human brain goes on unconsciously all the time. And I don't just mean, simple components of the visual information processing stream. I mean higher order things like what I was just talking about, color recognition, which is a cortical process, and processes like reading and face recognition, which in the case of reading is a uniquely human cortical process. All of this functionality can go on and does go on unconsciously. You can discriminate colors unconsciously. So the title of this paper on the screen summarizes the situation very well. There is indeed perception without awareness of what is perceived, learning without awareness of what is learnt. And so again, it brings us to the question, well, what does the awareness add? If you can do such complicated cognitive gymnastics as face recognition and color discrimination and so on, without there being any experience attached, then where does experience fit in with all of it? And I think that this is because because of what I've just summarized for you, perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. If visual cortical processing can go on and does go on for the most part unconsciously, then perhaps we shouldn't be looking to visual cortex as our model example of a neural instantiation of the function of consciousness. That is what we have done following Francis Crick's lead in the mid-1990s. The search for a neural correlate of consciousness has focused on visual cortical processing. But as I have now repeatedly said, visual cortical processing is not an intrinsically conscious business. So maybe we should be focusing on something else. I'm quoting here something by Sigmund Freud, the first person to seriously claim that most of our cognition goes on unconsciously. Even he makes the point that we can't speak of unconscious feelings. You can speak of unconscious visual information processing or unconscious language recognition or unconscious learning, but can you speak of an unconscious feeling? It's an oxymoron. So my view is that perhaps this is where we should be looking. If we're wanting to understand why there is something it is like to perform a particular mental mechanism, perhaps we should be looking at the mental mechanism that generates feeling, because that mechanism is intrinsically unconscious, unlike visual and other perceptual and other cortical cognitive processes. So this is not just a semantic point, as I'm about to explain to you. I think that the function of feeling is a much more promising candidate as a model example of consciousness, and a search for the mechanism of feeling should change the story. I'm going back to Chalmers just to illustrate that point. He says there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. And I'm saying, well, that's because he's talking about cognitive functions, which can go on unconsciously. If we were to replace that word with affective functions, I don't know if his claim is sustainable. Imagine saying there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. I'm saying there is one, the function of feeling. I think we can say in advance that an explanation of the function of feeling will automatically explain why it's experienced, because the very stuff of feeling, the very function of feeling, the very role of feeling is to be felt. And so this is what I'm now going to go on to talk to you about. Try to identify what the function of feeling is. Now, remember, I said it's not merely a semantic point. That's because I'm going to show you that feeling is generated in the very part of the brain that generates, that's intrinsic function is the generating of consciousness. And what is more, I'm going to show that it's that type of consciousness that it generates is feeling, the technical term for which is affect. We've known, in fact, since 1949, that all cortical consciousness is dependent upon brainstem arousal. The reticular activating system, which is what I'm pointing at now, in the brainstem, an exceedingly ancient structure, the reticular activating system, if you lesion just 2 cubic millimeters of a critical part of it, namely the parabrachial complex, that's enough to obliterate consciousness in the human being. Just 2 cubic millimeters. So it's the most concentrated consciousness producing tissue that there is. Why didn't we look there? As I said, since 1949, we've known when Maruzzi and Magoon, when they severed the ascending fibers from the reticular activating system, the cortical lights went out. So we've known since then that cortex is not intrinsically conscious. It acquires its consciousness from brainstem arousal. The reason why we didn't look to the brainstem to try to solve the problem of consciousness is because of the way that Magoon and Maruzzi conceptualized their findings. They said that the cortex remains the seat of consciousness. It's where the actual contents and qualities of our conscious experience are processed, but that the cortex can't do this job unless it's powered up by the reticular activating system of the brainstem. So the analogy that's been used ever since is the cortex is like a television set. And it's in the television set itself that all of the televisual contents and qualities are generated, or at least the processes that we perceive as such. But of course, a television set can't do its televisual thing unless it's plugged in at the wall. And so that's what they were saying the reticular activating system is. It's the power supply. It provides a necessary prerequisite for the cortex to do its conscious information processing. But it would be absurd on that basis to claim that consciousness itself is actually generated in the brainstem, just as it would be absurd to say that television actually arises from the power source in the socket in the wall. So what I'm going to show you now is the view that what the brainstem generates. Remember, this is everyone agrees it's the prerequisite for conscious processing. What the point of disagreement is that I'm now going to introduce you to is whether this prerequisite power supply, whether it is merely a purely quantitative level of consciousness that has no quality and has no content. I'm going to show you that it does have quality and content, and that quality and content is affective. In other words, feeling is generated by these brainstem nuclei. If the cortex were the seat of consciousness, then you have a testable prediction. In a person who has no cortex, you should see no consciousness. Not so. So let me introduce you to a patient who has no cortex. This is the MRI scan of a 3-year-old girl who's born with a condition called hydranencephaly, which basically means cerebrospinal fluid instead of an encephalon. So she has no forebrain, she has no cortex, none at all, on the cortical theory of consciousness, she should then be in a coma, or at the very least, she should be in a vegetative state, which is defined as non-responsive wakefulness. In other words, she should have blank consciousness at best. She just has the power supply, just this quantitative level, but no content and no quality. So now I'll show you, here she is. As you can see, she's conscious. She wakes up in the morning, she goes to sleep at night. Much more interestingly, you see what happens when her baby brother is placed on her lap. She responds emotionally. She goes, ah, she likes it. And this may puzzle you. How can she even register the presence of her brother on her lap? And the reason for that is because information coming up the optic nerve from the eye doesn't only go via the lateral genicular to occipital cortex, where visual consciousness is generated. It also goes via another tract to the superior colliculi, where visual information is processed unconsciously. And the same applies to tactile information, to gustatory information, and to auditory information. So the information is processed in the brainstem. It's just not processed consciously. Right next to the superior colliculi is the periaqueductal gray, and I'm going to show you that this is part of the brain complex of nuclei that generate feelings. You've already seen in that girl that she had feelings. Here's another one. She's by no means unique. Children with no cortex show feelings, and they show feelings in situationally appropriate ways. They respond affectively to stimuli, even though they're not consciously aware of what those stimuli are. They're not consciously aware of them. Nevertheless, it evokes emotional responses in them. Now, my colleagues say, well, how do you know that these girls are conscious? They might appear to be conscious, but perhaps what you're seeing is just reflex behavior. By the way, I find that an absurd claim. If you've interacted with these children, you can't for a moment think that they're responding just with reflexes. But the truth is, you cannot know what's going on in the mind of a person who can't tell you what's going on in their mind. The reportability criterion that my colleagues rely on, of course, can't apply in these cases because they've got no cortex, therefore they've got no language, therefore they can't tell us what it is like to be them. So I won't spend much time on this. I'll just say that if you take patients in whom great swathes of cortex are removed and the language area is preserved, especially cases in which that are specially associated with sentient being, remember the question I asked my professors as a student, where is the experiencing subject? in that information processing diagram. You know, where does it all come together? Well, there are two places that are usually said to be where it all comes together. And so let's look at what happens if one of those places is removed. Here is the prefrontal cortex, which is the most commonly cited candidate for. So all the information processing, visual information, auditory, somatosensory information, it's all re-represented in the prefrontal cortex. So here's a patient of mine who has no prefrontal cortex. You can see it here on the sagittal section, here on the horizontal section. Here's his language cortex. So he was able to speak. I'm not going to show you, because I don't have time, a transcript of my interview of him, but you just have to take it on face value that he tells you what it's like to be him. He's able to conjure up mental imagery, to describe it to me, and to make jokes, and to talk about himself, and interestingly, in terms of feelings, he, like all patients with frontal lobe damage, they have an excess of feelings. They are disinhibited. They are emotionally over effusive. It's called the frontal lobe personality. So if feelings were generated in the cortex, then you should have less of them when you've got less cortex. But in fact, what we observe is the opposite. There's more feeling. The other candidate cortical region is the insula. This is supposed to be where feeling is generated in the cortex. And if that were so, and this is supposed to be the basis of the cognitive self, this is what Bud Craig, for example, argues, if that were so, then patients with no insula, like this one, they should likewise have no sentient self, and certainly they should be deficient in terms of feelings. Again, I don't have time to go through the transcript of Damasio's interview with this patient, no insula at all. He speaks of himself, of his subjective experience, of his mental imagery, sentient being in the world, and he has feelings, just like the frontal lobe patients. In fact, he's overwhelmed by feelings. There's an excess of feelings in these cases. Now, my colleagues say, well, in these cases, there's still plenty of cortex left. So, you know, you can't say on the basis of this sort of evidence that the cortex is not the seat of consciousness. And remember, they said the same about this sort of evidence, you know, children with absolutely no cortex. They're saying, well, you can't use this kind of evidence either. So, you know, you can't win with that argument because these children can't speak. We don't know whether they're conscious. And when we go to the patients who can speak, we say, well, they've got some cortex. So, you know, that might be the remaining cortex that is generating their consciousness and their feelings and their sentient subjective being. This what it is like that Tom Nagel speaks of. So let me quickly show you some other evidence, because now we have to use other evidence than lesion evidence, because the lesion evidence is exhaustive, even though I think it's pretty overwhelming, these kids with no cortex at all. But, you know, we can't be sure. So let's look what one does in science in a case like this. You look for converging lines of evidence and the weight of the evidence to come to any kind of reasonable conclusion. So if it were the case that the brainstem generates feelings, which is what I'm saying it is the case, then there's another testable prediction. If you stimulate the structures in the brainstem, the reticular activating structures that I've spoken of, you should be able to generate feelings. And that's exactly what happens. I'm going to show you a transcript now of this case, a patient in whom the substantia nigra was stimulated electrically, accidentally as it happens, because the surgeon was going for a structure just above that for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. This patient's not a psychiatric patient. She got no psychiatric history, but accidentally Blomstedt, the surgeon, stimulated this part of the reticular activating system. And what it did, within 5 seconds of the stimulator being switched on, the patient fell into a profound depression. She was suicidal. I no longer wish to live. She says, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything's useless. always feeling worthless. I'm crying over myself, of course. I'm hopeless. Why am I bothering you? That's suicidal depression, generated artificially within 5 seconds of stimulation of a part of the reticular activating system. When the stimulator is switched off, 90 seconds later, the depression's gone. And whenever Blomstedt, with the patient's agreement, switched the electrode on again, in the substantia nigra, he brought on the very same depressive feeling. I'm just giving you one case. There are many cases like this. It confirms the prediction. If you stimulate the reticular activating system or the periaqueductal gray, that structure that I showed you next to the superior colliculi, these deep ancient brainstem structures, which are supposed to just switch on the lights, this power supply to the cortex. Clearly, stimulating these structures generates a content and a quality of consciousness, and that is feeling, affect. In fact, the periaqueductal gray is the area which produces stimulation of which produces the widest range and the most intense affects of any part of the brain. The reticular activating nuclei are second most wide range of affects and most intense affects. Stimulation of the cortex produces next to no affects. So add that to the lesion evidence. I think that my claim that these are the structures that generate affect is bolstered. Let's use another method, positron emission tomography. This is a study done by Damasio. The prediction, again, would be you take people who are experiencing intense affects, put them in the scanner. If the area of highest metabolic turnover is in the cortex, then you would have to say that the feelings are being generated in cortex. But our prediction is that the highest signal will be in the brain stem, and that's what you find. For a wide range of basic affective states, like sadness, it's in the brain stem. Look at the cortex by comparison. Anger, the brain stem. Happiness, brain stem, and this dopaminergic circuit arising from the ventral tegmental area. This is all subcortical. That's happiness, that's anger, that's sadness. This is fear, same thing. The arousal is in the brain stem, not in the cortex. So that's three completely different methods: lesion method, deep brain stimulation method, functional neuroimaging method, all converge on the conclusion that feeling is generated in and by the brain stem and by the reticular activating system in particular, and the periaqueductal gray. Last method is pharmacological manipulation. If you manipulate the neurotransmitters that are sourced in the reticular activating system, you don't just get increases and decreases in the level of consciousness, you get distinct affective changes. This is why serotonin, which is sourced in this part of the, it's called the RAFE, this part of the reticular activating system. This is why antidepressants target serotonin. Antipsychotics target dopamine, which is sourced in the ventral tegmental area, also part of the reticular activating system. And likewise, anti-anxiety drugs target noradrenaline, which is sourced in the locus ceruleus complex, another part of the reticular activating system. So it is if these nuclei, the source nuclei of these neurotransmitters were just switching on the lights, they would be of interest to anesthetists. But psychiatrists tinker with these neurochemicals all the time. The mainstay of psychopharmacological medication is neurotransmitter systems that arise from the reticular activating system. So these are all the reasons why I think that this part of the brain generates feeling, generates affect. And secondly, remember that we all are agreed that this part of the brain's functioning is fundamental to consciousness. If this part of the brain is lesioned, even just 2 cubic millimeters in critical parts of it, the lights go out. The patient goes into coma. By contrast, as you saw, they're patients with no cortex at all, in whom the lights are on. So it's clear that the lights are switched on down here, and you add that to my argument that this light switch is not just a quantity or a level of consciousness. It clearly has quality and content. Then you have to come to the conclusion, or at least I've come to the conclusion, that this is the basic form of consciousness. This prerequisite form upon which all cortical consciousness depends is affective. And therefore, affective feeling is the elemental form of consciousness. It's also the most ancient form down there in the brainstem. These structures are more than 500 million years old in evolutionary terms. That the dawn of consciousness probably arose with the evolution of these structures. And in any event, leaving aside evolutionary stories, it's clearly functionally the case that all other forms of consciousness, all these cortical forms are dependent upon this form. And for all of these reasons, I think this is where we should be looking if we want to discern the functional mechanism of consciousness, this thing that Chalmers was talking about at the beginning. As I said to you, his argument has merit when it comes to cortical visual processing and other cortical processes, because they're not intrinsically conscious. They only become conscious to the extent that they're aroused by, activated by the reticular activating system. So that's where we should be looking if we want to. This is why we've made so little progress in terms of trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness. So what is the mechanism, the functional mechanism of feeling? Well, it is homeostasis. It's an extended form of homeostasis. Homeostasis is a very basic biological function. It is probably the most basic mechanism that explains the difference between living and non-living things. It is an anti-entropic mechanism. We don't just explore all possible states. We have to remain within very specific states across multiple categorical variables. I'm talking about things like core body temperature. You have to stay between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. You can't just equalize with the ambient temperature. Likewise, with regard to blood oxygen levels, with regard to water levels, with regard to heart rate, blood pressure, etc., etc. There are all sorts of things. You have to stay within a narrow physiological range. Now, much of that is regulated autonomically, that is to say, unconsciously, automatically. But some of these homeostats extend into feeling. And that's what I think the function of feeling is. I'll explain that by reference to a single example, which is respiratory control. The respiratory control is normally unconscious. That happens automatically. You don't need to deliberately think, breathe. It just happens. That's because it's such an automatic function, because it's so predictable. What you need to do is always the same thing, which is just intercostal muscles expand, air goes in, then they contract, air goes out, then they and it always works. It keeps your blood gases in balance. But when you move into an uncertain situation, like for example a carbon dioxide filled room, suddenly consciousness of the need to breathe intrudes, forcibly intrudes, and you become aware of what we call suffocation alarm or air hunger, respiratory distress. It's an extremely unpleasant feeling. And I'm using the example of, remember, just one of these homeostatic needs. There are many. But in this one, what is the unpleasant feeling for? It's for navigating uncertainty. So the person feeling air hunger, they don't know what to do. They've never been in a burning building before, let alone this particular one. And they use the feeling to make choices, to determine whether the choices they're making are good or bad. If you go upstairs and there's less oxygen there, you feel it. The unpleasure of the suffocation alarm increases. If by contrast you go downstairs and there's more availability of oxygen, the air hunger, the distressing feeling is replaced by a feeling of relief. And those feelings tell the organism whether it's doing the right or the wrong thing in conditions unpredicted situations, in conditions of uncertainty. So we literally feel our way through the problem. In order to make choices, this is the whole basis of voluntary behavior as opposed to autonomic, automatized action. To make choices, they have to be rooted in a value system. There has to be something which is better and something that is worse. Here, the value system is the one that underpins all life, namely that it's good to survive and bad to die. And the feeling tells you if you're moving outside of your homeostatic range, it tells you you're going to die. And here, the feeling tells you as you're moving back to being within your homeostatically viable range, you're going to make it after all. So the feelings, the value system underwrite the choices that the organism makes. Remember there, I told you, I'm just speaking about one example, but this is one category of biological need in blood gas balance. But you have different categories, and why I emphasize that is that they are categories. Each one of those needs has to be met in its own right. They can't be reduced to a single common denominator, total need. You can't say, I've got 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 2 out of 10 of hunger. So that makes 10 out of 20 of total need. So I'll just sleep and I'll never eat, just to keep the common denominator down, the need down. Each of these needs has to be met in their own right. That means that they have to be treated categorically, which means that they are intrinsically qualitatively distinct variables. So we feel suffocation alarm, we feel thirst, we feel sleepiness, we feel the need to urinate, we feel angry, we feel scared, etc. Each one of these feelings has a quality of its own. They all have a valence, an unpleasure and a pleasure, but they also have quality. This is the fundamental stuff of consciousness in my view, and that's its fundamental function. It enables an organism to survive in unpredicted situations by using feeling as a basis for making choices, which is a massive adaptive advantage, where you can also not only by trial and error in this way survive in unpredicted environments, and God knows there are plenty of those about, but you can also learn from the experience. And this ability to learn during our ontogenetic lifetime is an enormous advance over the simpler mechanism, the one that relies purely on reflexes, which requires great swathes of the species to die, and just those few that happen to do the right thing by chance end up passing on their genes and thereby gradually evolving new reflexes. That's the functionality that feeling introduces into the brain. This is what I think the function of feeling is. So I hope you will agree with me that this addresses the question, why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? I think this question is only perplexing when it's asked in relation to visual information processing. It's not at all perplexing when it comes to these affective functions that I've been talking to you about. It's patently obvious why and how there's something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism, when you realize that the function of something it is likeness of qualitative valenced feeling is to enable the organism. It's an intrinsically subjective state. It's about my state. It's about my very continued existence. And this is what the function of feeling is. It enables the organism to navigate the world, make decisions, and learn from experience on the basis of feeling. Likewise, this question, why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't it go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? Well, I've just told you why. The inner feel, what it's there for. You can't do that without the inner feel. That's the very function of feeling. It's for the organism to know its own state in this qualified valenced way, which is intrinsically subjective and necessarily has existential consequences for the organism. Now, I'm mindful of the audience that I'm talking to. You're not neurobiologists, so I'll just quickly link this to some work that I've done with a computational neuroscientist, Carl Friston. The brain has a predictive model. It has a range of prior preferences, its preferred states that it has to remain in, as I've said to you. So it predicts, if I do this, like in a reflex, if I do this in the outside world, then the following sensory state, the expected sensory state, will follow. And this is how I stay within my homeostatically viable bounds. That's how reflex works. Then there's an error signal. If the organism is going to be able to learn from its mistakes, then when the expected sensory outcome, like the expected sensing of oxygen level, does not come about, there's an error signal, and on the basis of that signal, the system updates its prediction and then tries again. And this, the modulation of statistical confidence between predictions and errors, this is mediated by the precision of the prediction and of the error. As the organism has greater confidence in its prediction, so it has less confidence in the error signal. As the precision in the error signal increases, so it has proportionately less confidence in its prediction. So basically, and that's affect. This is how affect works. So the modulation, physiologically, it's postsynaptic gain. It's what the reticular activating system does, increasing or decreasing the gain on these signals. The message passing that goes on up here is modulated by these arousal structures down here. And put very simply, if things are going as expected, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, that's bad. And of course, here we have just one such homeostat. Remember, I told you there are a range of these homeostats, and one of them is prioritized at any point in time, and the feeling then that modulates the cognitions, that is to say, the message passing, the decision making, the predictions over the error signals, is the sort of operating mode of the system when it's in separation distress or suffocation alarm or hunger or thirst or whatever. So that's the basic mechanism of it. As you all know, Feynman's famous statement, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So on the basis of that, I, with some of your colleagues, we're busy trying to make an artificial affective self-organizing system, which its sole aim, its sole purpose is to continue to exist by meeting its own needs. We've given it a range of needs, and we're busy developing the algorithms, unpacking these basic principles that I just explained to you. Bruce Bassett, you might know him, Benjamin Rossman, and Jonathan Schock. I think that they're part of your community. I think, in fact, it was one of them who suggested that Francesca invite me to give you this talk, which is now over. And remember, all I was aiming to do was to give you a clue. So that's the clue. I think we should be looking there if we're wanting to solve the hard problem of consciousness. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for a really fascinating talk. Thank you. I'm sure there will be questions from the audience. Please raise your hand or use the Q&A. And here we go. The first question is coming, and I will give Tommy the right to speak. Tommy, you are already there. You're welcome to ask your questions.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Mark, for an interesting talk. A quick question about the way in which you approach this. You started off by talking about consciousness or not being conscious as the lights being off, and consciousness as the lights being on, so to speak. So this kind of almost implies a binary notion of there either being consciousness or not. But from what I understand, it seems to me that from what you're saying, that one could probably think of consciousness more as not necessarily the lights being just on or off, but maybe the lights are more dimmer somewhere than in some areas than in others. Is that a correct way of thinking about this, that consciousness is more on a spectrum?
Well, yes, it is on a spectrum, but when you the last thing you said slightly puzzled me when you said some areas rather than others. I thought you were talking about clinical states, or for that matter, our own normal functional states. You know, all of us know from our own daily experience, there are times when you're more alert and conscious and times when you know, sort of drifting off. This is the level of consciousness. It's likewise in patients, neurological patients, we grade it over a 15-point scale. It's called the Glasgow Coma Scale, where we quantify the level of consciousness. So yes, it's a graded thing. But I think I might have misunderstood you, because you speak now about different places, and you know, that's also fine. Yeah, the cortex is activated by the brainstem, and that activation is constantly modulated topographically. So it's not only a matter of changes in level, it's also a matter of changes in location. Yeah.
Maybe just a quick follow-up then. So what you've described now seems to be in you know, maybe just in humans, for example, just in a single type of organism. But my question was more related to whether, if we look at different organisms, does it make sense to talk about kind of different levels or a spectrum of consciousness across, you know, all living organisms, something like that?
Well, I see you speaking of it now in evolutionary terms. Look, the mechanism I have drawn your attention to, the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, is found in all vertebrates, and it does pretty much the same thing in all vertebrates. Every testable prediction, like for example, you take a zebrafish and you stimulate the part of the periaqueductal gray, which in us causes us intense pain. You predict the fish is going to get the hell away from the stimulus. That's what happens. And conversely, the ones that cause orgasmic delight in us, you predict that the fish is going to be very attracted to that stimulus, and that's what happens. But beyond vertebrates, it starts to get difficult, because there are no clear homologs in the brains of non-vertebrate creatures. That doesn't mean that they're not conscious, but I most certainly wouldn't say that it applies to all living things. The functionality that we're talking about, which is the ability to make choices, remember, to come up with adaptive behaviors in novel, unpredicted environments, to do something different, something that's not pre-wired. That is, there are very many living things. Certainly, all plants don't have that. All bacteria don't have that, and so on. So it's only once we get beyond the level of reflex that we start to see the functionality I'm talking about. That's the really important thing, is that the function of feeling does something. You know, it has causal consequences. The feeling is a natural biological process which does something which in its absence is lost, and that something is not unimportant. It's the capacity for voluntary action.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I have a whole bunch of other questions, but I'm going to leave it at that for now and hand it over to some other questions or some other.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. We might come back to you if we still have some time. There was a question, but I just followed the order in which the hands were raised on my screen. By Roland Dapp, please, you just need to unmute yourself and you're welcome to ask your question.
Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes,
thanks so much for the presentation. That was really interesting. So I just have 2 points. The first one is a question. Do you mean to equate feelings with consciousness? So as like a counter argument or a counterpoint, like what about the subjective experience of visual perception, like something that is distinct from emotions, but is still clearly a presence of consciousness. And so my second point is with regards to the questions on like the hard problem of consciousness, you sort of dismissed the claims or the counter arguments, like, well, why isn't all of this just happening in the dark? And I've got to say, like, I agree with those counterclaims. So, like, I mean, what you've described is like a very insightful mechanistic description of, you know, the function of these sort of valent feelings and why they might have arisen evolutionarily, and, you know, indeed, like, why they sort of preclude higher level functions in terms of their like structure in the brain. But like, for example, the idea of like the philosophical zombie, the man who walks and talks and thinks just like us, but doesn't have anything, doesn't experience anything. I don't see there being any plausible, functional, mechanistic description, which to me would satisfy the question of why does this machine experience itself in any way? Why couldn't we have hunger and sadness as mechanistic inputs to a larger system? Why does I just don't see it necessarily as a route to solve the hard problem of consciousness through mechanistic descriptions. Yeah, those are my points.
So to your first question, I don't equate feeling with all consciousness. I'm saying that feeling is the elementary foundational form of consciousness, and also I'm drawing attention to the incontrovertible fact that all other forms of consciousness cannot exist without feeling. So the feeling, unless you have brainstem arousal, all the other forms don't work. So they are dependent upon this basic form, and that's why I'm saying if we're wanting to understand what its basic mechanism is, that's where we should look. There's much that I could say in response to that question because it's actually very complicated, but I'll just give some headlines. I think of feeling as the demand made upon cognition for work, predictive work, and that cognition, when conscious, is the predictive work itself. So conscious cognition, feeling your way through the life's problems, is the response to the demand. So conscious cognition is different from unconscious cognition in that it is palpated by feeling in the way that I described. In other words, the modulation of the confidence in the prediction in relation to the error signal, it's not just a monotonous precision like with reflexes. That's what the functional contribution of the feeling is. And that palpating of uncertainty over a deep hierarchy in terms of the cognitive functions, it has consequences which ultimately get very far removed from the existential consequences of the uncertainty in relation to the basic policy. So uncertainty about what exactly is going to happen in this receptive field of my retina right now, it may be conscious because it's the same basic mechanism, but its contribution to the fundamental driving force of the mechanism is minuscule. It's not felt as an affect. Now, your second question, again, it's a very big question. You say that you don't see why all of this couldn't happen in the dark without feeling. So let me just draw, and then you speak of philosophical zombies. So let me just draw your attention to what I think that perplexity only arose because we started asking the question in relation to vision, where, as I said at the beginning of my talk, you don't have to be conscious to see. So the question, only arose because of that. I think had we started with the kind of mechanism I just spoke to you about, it's how does the organism know its own state with existential quality consequences within necessarily qualitatively distinctive categories of need, which are valenced, which is necessarily subjective. What I've just described just is a feeling. That's what a feeling is. A feeling is a qualitatively distinctive state which has consequences for the organism, and it uses this registering of its subjective state to palpate everything that it does. It just is what a feeling is. So you then say, well, why couldn't you have that without feeling? It's like saying, well, why couldn't we have creatures without legs? Well, we just do have legs. That's not the only way to ambulate. We could have had wheels, but as it happens, we develop legs and they work. So, feeling is what evolved to solve this problem of the one that I've described. And I think that it's not surprising. It's not mysterious. It's this thing about philosophical zombies. I just don't agree. Are you saying if you had a machine that had exactly the same functionality as us, but it didn't feel, I would say, well, then it doesn't have the same functionality as us. It wouldn't be able to do what we can do. And interestingly enough, I just had a debate in a journal, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which is the one where Chalmers originally published his paper. They had a debate about my theory, and Tom Nagel, the guy who I quoted, participated in it, and he accepts that there's no such thing as that doesn't make sense to say that you have a zombie with the same function. It can't have affective functionality and be a zombie. If it has that affective functionality, it wouldn't be. It would not be a zombie. The one thing causes the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have a question now by Igle Glethill. Igle, please, you're most welcome to ask your question.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking. I would like to ask about localization. I'm a physicist with a sort of slight acquaintance with neural nets. In a neural net, a memory or state is not local. It's delocalized in some sense. So is it possible that the nature of consciousness or feelings involves both the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, or more than one locality of the brain, or is there such specialization among the parts of the brain?
So I am not a narrow localizationist. I want to just be clear that the reason I used lesion data was in order to demonstrate that in the absence of cortex, you can still have consciousness, and the converse doesn't apply. In the absence of a brainstem, you can't have consciousness. So I was drawing an artificial distinction there in order to show, that the actual basic mechanism of consciousness is in the brainstem. But what the brainstem does, as I tried to say very briefly toward the end of my talk, is modulate cortical processes. In fact, there's the reticular activating system, its whole functionality. It's called the ascending reticular activating system. Because it's what it does is it palpates what's going on up there in cortex. So normally they work together, I've just artificially separated the two in order to make the point that the one is prerequisite for the other. I don't mean to imply that it normally functions by itself. Also, when it comes to the periaqueductal gray, which is not part of the reticular activator, all the different homeostatic mechanisms, the residual error signal, in other words, the error signal that has not been dealt with by the predictive hierarchy, as the error penetrates that hierarchy, the residual signal converges on periaqueductal gray. So there's some pivotal function that the periaqueductal gray is performing, which I think has to do with the prioritization. Which one of these error signals is the currently most salient, which is going to determine the currently prioritized affect, which then makes determines the policy in terms of which need can I not rely on automatized solutions. Which one of these does the uncertainty have to be palpated over this action cycle? So there's a unique contribution by each one of these structures, but they are that prioritization function then immediately changes what the reticular activating system does, which immediately changes what the whole forebrain does, which then feeds back to PAG again. And so, yeah, it's all interconnected ultimately. But in science, we reduce things down to their elements in order to understand them. Then we put them all together again.
Thank you. And we have one more question by Zurab Yanelidze. Zurab, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm a mathematician, and I was wondering, how would you respond to the following paradox? So if we are able to answer the question, what is consciousness, by giving its detailed logical description, for example, through your theory or maybe further development of your theory. Okay, so all good. So then we can fully understand what consciousness is in a scientific way, which means in a logical way. And then it would appear that, in a sense, logic is more fundamental than human being. But at the same time, the only way logic arises in the explicit form that we are able to make use of it is through human beings. So, and then there is this problem. So if logic is more fundamental than human being, then how come logic only arises through human beings? Maybe logic is just one of the illusions that we experience, one of other types of feelings that is not quite a feeling, it's not quite a sensation, but some stories we make up and so on. So how would you respond to that paradox of which comes first, logic or human or consciousness?
I think that it's a question of, are the laws of nature discovered or are they invented? I am of the view that they are discovered. In other words, let's refer to Francesco's field, quantum physics, or in fact to very basic thing like the Big Bang and the coming into being of our universe, and then all of the ways in which it's behaved ever since then. Long before Earth formed, long before life emerged on Earth, long before conscious life emerged on Earth, all of those events couldn't possibly have required conscious life on Earth to have first been able to invent them.
But
so this is why I'm of the view that we're discovering these laws.
But all of the things you're saying, all of the things you're saying now, you can only share this point of view with human beings. You're not able to share this with anyone else apart from human beings. So maybe it's just our illusion that maybe it's part of a human being illusion that the world is like that. Whether it's discovered or invented, the whole question of being discovered or invented is already something that we can only share between each other.
My point is that the same argument applies to everything in natural science. This is not something that's unique to the explanation of consciousness. It applies to the explanation of anything. We can only communicate with each other about the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of mathematics, and the laws of neuroscience, and psychology.
Well,
so this is, we need consciousness to be able to communicate with each other about it, but that doesn't mean that the laws behind consciousness are different in kind from the laws behind everything else. But I will grant you this, of course, that I wouldn't begin to claim that we have a complete understanding of anything, or even that we are ever capable of obtaining a complete understanding of anything. Because of our limited instruments, we're groping in the dark, and we're trying to come up with less bad explanations to reduce our uncertainty, but we're never going to see the face of God, if that's what you're asking me about.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ilya, I see there is a question in the Q&A. Do you want to guide us through that one?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Thank you for the excellent talk, Prof Solms. Can we then have the following analogy? Cortex is the TV. Function of the brainstem expresses feeling of the TV show. Where then is the subject owner of feeling? It is the sense of me locating. Can feeling exist without presence of me, self-awareness? Or is the magnitude of feeling scalable, proportional to the level of consciousness? Is the deviation to feeling homeostasis proportional to the level of self-consciousness? Apology for my confusion in this question, as I'm not working in the field.
No, thank you. That's a good question. I think we need to start with the problem of definitions of consciousness. I think that sadly, for most of us, by the word consciousness, we mean this very complicated, self-reflective experience that we humans are capable of, with our unique linguistic symbolic systems and everything. That's the most complex form of consciousness. I wouldn't start there in terms of trying to solve the problem of what consciousness itself is. And for that, I use the definition that Chalmers and Nagel themselves used, namely that there is something it is like to be. So there is something it is like to be some organisms, but there's not something it is like to be other organisms. So for me, the fundamental definition of consciousness, like I can ask, is there something it is like to be a cell phone? The answer is no. Is there something that it's like to be me? The answer is yes. That makes me conscious and my cell phone not conscious. However, to come to the nub of your question, that does not mean that this elementary, basic form of consciousness, which is just raw feeling, that doesn't mean that is the totality of what we mean by consciousness. There is just raw feeling, by which I mean, let me say, for example, you can feel pain without knowing anything about where it's come from, without having any reflective thoughts about it, any understanding of pain. It's just a feeling. That's a state of consciousness. But to have all these other things, to be able to understand, well, what is it that so it's just, I feel like this without words. It's a feeling. That is being in a sentient state. Then to be able to say, I feel like this about that is a great step forwards. It's not just the feeling. It's being able to attach the feeling to your representation of your state, and then to be able to reflect upon that. All of those things certainly expand what we mean by consciousness and expand the functionality of consciousness, the basic functionality being to be able to navigate uncertainty in the service of homeostasis. But certainly there are more elaborate forms of consciousness as we build up over those hierarchies. So I've got cortex, and I'm very glad to have it, and I don't want it removed. It adds to my experience of being a very great deal, and it adds to my capacity to function properly a very great deal. So that's not in question for a moment. What's in question is, should we be focusing on that complicated stuff at the top in order to understand what consciousness is, or should we be focusing on this elementary form of it at the bottom, which in fact is what gives rise to all the higher forms ultimately? And I'm saying we should focus on the bottom form. That doesn't mean that we reduce all of that complex stuff to the bottom form. I'm saying that we should focus on the basics in order to understand the complexity.
I think, Mark, if you have time, we have one more question.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Adeshina, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Professor, for your presentation. This has just been on my mind. I have a background in biochemistry, and I've just imagined for some time, looking at the way our cells interact, the way our metabolism work, the way it's regulated, and all of these. Sometimes I'm forced to think that could there be various levels of consciousness? As we are conscious of our environment, it seems like maybe the cells, the molecules are conscious of their environment and are able to respond accordingly. So is it then logical to say perhaps there are various levels of consciousness, and even perhaps we might be part of a bigger consciousness, just as our cells come together to form us, and these cells are capable of interacting with their environment within our self as the host. Could we also be part of maybe a bigger consciousness? We are like cells in another higher consciousness. I don't know. I know it might seem like a crazy question, but I just wanted to put it out there. Thank you.
It's not a crazy question, but it's a question that cannot be given, definite answers. I'll tell you what you're touching on a problem. It's called the problem of other minds, which basically boils down to the fact that consciousness is a subjective state. By definition, it's what it is like to be the thing that is conscious. It's the state of being that thing. So you can only ever be yourself. So you can only ever know your own conscious state observationally. You can't observe the consciousness of even any other human being. You can infer it. There's very good evidence that you are conscious, because you're a human being, and because you're speaking and you can tell me, and because you're like me and I know I'm conscious. So, you're behaving like me. So presumably what's driving your behavior is consciousness too. But I can't observe it. So this is the problem of other minds. Now, it's a trivial problem when it comes to other human beings like you who can speak and, who like me and so on. It becomes a slightly more difficult question as you go to other creatures. I have, as I mentioned earlier, my strategy is to say, well, what is the anatomical formation and the physiological action in the human brain that seems to be the fundamental driving force of consciousness? And then I see in other creatures that have that same mechanism, I can make testable predictions about what I expect will happen if I stimulate this or that lesion, this or that, chemically modulate this or that. And on that basis, I can come up with more or less secure inferences that they too are conscious. As you go beyond vertebrate brains, as I said earlier, it becomes more difficult to do that. Then we start looking at the functionality. For me, an organism that doesn't have the functionality that I've talked to you about, it's hard to, I find it increasingly less persuasive that they're conscious. But it becomes increasingly uncertain as we go down. Now, you then speak in the other direction and say, well, is there perhaps a consciousness which we are part of, us? Perhaps there's a collective human consciousness, or perhaps there's a collective consciousness of a particular nation, or whatever the case may be. I don't know. For the same reason, you've got to be a nation to be able to know whether it feels like something to be a nation or to be a species as a whole, as opposed to just a member of that species. You just have to look at the plausibility and then come up with your best guess. I'm afraid that's the best I can do by way of answering it. But we have tried to be as specific as possible about the mechanism that we are I and my colleagues are postulating as the basic mechanism of consciousness, and it arises in a self-organizing system with multiple needs. I think a self-organizing system with a Markov blanket, with some sort of bounding membrane that separates it from its surrounds, is a prerequisite for selfhood. Is that there has to be, something that could be a self, that would be non-dissipative, and so on. So once you start speaking about, these are more amorphous organizations that don't have a clear boundary between what is and what is not part of the system, I start finding it, in my own mechanistic understanding, I start finding it hard to attribute selfhood, in other words, subjectness, to something that doesn't have a clear separation between itself and between the system and the non-system. Perhaps I'm no longer being clear, which is a good reason to stop answering the question.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe I can ask a quick last question. At some stage, you show that the mathematical model that you are developing, and at some stage you mentioned quantum physics. Yeah, do you think there is any space that some quantum effects mysteriously plays a role in all of this?
There are colleagues who are respectable in my field, who make such claims. In fact, there's a colleague who's respectable in your field, Roger Penrose, who makes such claims. Yeah. I think that the scale that we are talking about, in other words, the organismic scale, of course, there are quantum mechanisms at work within everything, including every organism. There are quantum, you go down sufficiently small scale, you're going to find that. But I think that at our scale, it all gets averaged out. I very much doubt that the fundamental physics of, I think that the physics of consciousness are a physics at a much higher scale of self-organizing systems, and I don't think we need to use those more elementary. We don't have to have recourse to those more elementary mechanisms in order to understand consciousness. I think consciousness, as I have sort of said, I think that there's a very long time between the origin of the universe and the origin of consciousness. Consciousness is quite a high-level, complex biological phenomenon that doesn't require that scale of explanation. But of course, in the end, it must be compatible with quantum physics. I think it's very interesting that the sorts of statistical physics that we invoke in order to explain these probabilistic processes, information processing that goes on in a sentient self, that it is all probabilistic, and so there's a kind of deep seam that goes down to your science, and that's how it should be.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you. I think we went a little bit over time, but that is a very good sign, because it means that everybody was enjoyed very much your talk, and we had lots of questions. So Mark, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your very profound insights in what consciousness is all about. And and we will definitely read your papers and try to understand the mathematical modeling behind it. So thank you very much. Then,
thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks you
for having me.
And tomorrow we will send you the link of the video so that you can share it if you want with colleagues and friends. Yeah. So then thank you very much to everyone. have a great evening, and still be careful. There's still COVID out there, and now there's also monkeypox. so it's better be careful. Yeah. So thank you very much. And next week we'll be here again with another interesting talk. Yeah. So no, thank you very much, everyone. Good night, Mark, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.